I didn't even realize that it's been too long since my last Super NES Nostalgia Trip episode, before I went browsing retro games in a web store a couple of weeks ago and came across a game that I didn't remember I was missing from my youth. So, in a way, this game, Cliffhanger, isn't actually a proper Nostalgia Trip game since I haven't played it since I was maybe 16 or 17 years old. But it is very nostalgic for me, because it's one of those games that my friend SJ had at the time for a short while, and when I saw this game being sold, my mind instantly brought up vague memories of climbing a wall, jumping over chasms, and running away from an avalanche. In a certain way, this was probably the closest thing to a Finnish game you could have on a Super Nintendo or a Sega console if you had one of those, since Cliffhanger, the movie that the game was based on, was directed by the so far only Finnish Hollywood movie director Renny Harlin. Even though the game is not credited to have any Finnish personnel behind it, the sheer mediocrity of it could be considered a tribute to the movie. It's not a bad game as such, just a little too much for its own good, despite being basically just another beat-em-up, and not nearly fine-tuned enough to put it in the league of games like Turtles in Time. But anyway, Cliffhanger is now firmly in my nostalgia trip list. This next game will not come as too much of a surprise since its sequel was already featured in the last Nintendo 64 episode. For today's obligatory racing game, we have the original F-Zero, which was one of the console's launch titles. In fact, it was the second of only two games released upon the launch of Super Famicom in Japan, the other one being Super Mario World. Similarly to the Pilot Wings series, F-Zero was designed to showcase the console's abilities, which in this case was the Mode 7 scrolling technique, which was the first game on the 16-bit Nintendo system to show off its 3D capabilities, even if it wasn't fully 3D yet. My memories of F-Zero from the 90s are vague at best, but it was one of the first games I ever bought from my own Super NES about over 20 years ago. While it doesn't offer the same entertainment value as Mario Kart, I've always thought F-Zero the more impressive racing game in certain ways. The way the game handles cornering is somehow a little more natural than in Mario Kart, if you can call hovering vehicles natural in any way. Also, F-Zero has the actual racing balanced better than Mario Kart, which is some sort of forced balancing thing going for the players in the lead and at the back, a feature which actually got even worse with every new Mario Kart. F-Zero is definitely an influential game, and it paved the way for not only to the likes of Mario Kart and Wipeout, but practically any 3D racing game on any console. And for that reason alone, it's obligatory to experience for any gaming historian. And for Nintendo retro collectors, it's one of the first games you should have in your collection. And I could practically say the same thing about this next game, Starfox, if you're an American or Japanese consumer, or Starwing, if you're from Europe. This being one of Nintendo's many flagship games for the Super NES, it has an interesting backstory to how it came about. You can read more about it on Wikipedia and other sources, but basically, a British game developer company called Argonaut Games struck a deal with Nintendo by breaking into the Game Boy's copyright protection mechanism, and their work to get a Star Glider-like game on the Super NES resulted in the design of the Super FX chip, which would make Starfox, or Starwing, the first game to feature proper polygonal 3D graphics on a Super Nintendo game. Personally, I was never a big fan of polygonal 3D graphics on the 8-bit, so visually, Starfox has never had as big an appeal for me as it might have done if the style was new to me. However, it's not a free roaming game but rather a rail shooter of some sort, and without the slightly claustrophobia-inducing first-person view from within the cockpit of a spacecraft, it becomes more like a glorified Space Invaders. Also, the game runs smooth and has enough of a cartoon style to make it more charming in ways other polygon 3D space shooters were not. It's not my most revisited Super NES games, but for me it is surprisingly entertaining for its genre, and for that it gets my recommendations similarly to its sequels. The second of my 3 favorite puzzle games for the Super NES was found through emulation in its original Japanese form, Super Puyo Puyo 2, and to this day the Japanese Super NES version remains my favorite version of the game. I first bought it as the European version, Kirby's Ghost Trap, while one of my friends had the American version, Kirby's Avalanche. And in early May this year, I finally ordered the Japanese Super Puyo Puyo 2 to complete the circle. As if that weren't enough, Sega Mega Drive had it as part of the Sonic franchise, released under the title Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, which I also have. The Puyo Puyo games are the sort of Tetris variants in which 2 blobs of different colors connected to each other drop down the pit. Your job is to connect 4 or more of other similarly colored blobs in any order to pop them all off and make room for more blobs. If you manage to organize chain reactions, your opponent's pit will be delivered a bunch of junk blobs, which need to be popped off by popping off some other blobs immediately next to the junk blobs. Puyo Puyo and its sequels were originally arcade games and were enormously successful in Japan. Of course, being practically impossible to translate into any language, the game didn't achieve similar success outside of Japan, so it suffered a similar fate as Tetris Attack in the first years of its existence. Happily, Puyo Puyo has more recently been accepted as the official global title of the franchise, as is only proper, and I can only give my highest recommendations of this franchise to all discerning puzzle gamers out there. This episode turned into an odd collection of games that have different titles in different regions. Our last one today was published as Zombies here in Europe, but the full proper title in all its American B-movie glamour is Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Although the game was published by Konami, we actually have LucasArts, of all game developers, to thank for this masterpiece of comedy, sci-fi, horror, action, adventuring piece of nonsense. But I chose that word nonsense because the game is wonderfully nonsensical, and it's exactly one of the reasons it has become one of my all-time favorite Super Nintendo games. The game is sort of like a silly version of the Chaos Engine. You control a teenager with a water squirt gun, or 2 teenagers if you play with a friend, and you need to rescue stranded and immobile people before they're devoured by zombies. Basically, you just collect all the people from each level while shooting all the zombies, and once the level is cleared, you proceed to the exit that pops out of thin air. What makes Zombies Ate My Neighbors such a favorite for me, and some of my friends too, is the hilarious soundtrack coupled with great sceneries and the brilliant cooperative 2-player mode. Zombies Ate My Neighbors was one of the biggest finds through emulation, and I spent a good few hours with my friends playing this game until it eventually started becoming tedious due to repetition. I eventually bought the European version of it, which to my utter disappointment doesn't have a chainsaw in its weaponry, so I usually play the American version from my SD card reader. It's always a fun game to return to at least once a year, even if it's not Halloween.